TTRPGs are great. They allow you to weave together stories with endless possibilities. In fantasy games, it puts you in the driver's seat, allowing you to shape the destiny of the world in dramatic and fantastic ways. I love the tactical combat that these games provide just as much as I love the stories the combats shape. In particularly dramatic moments, a single dice roll can change the entire campaign world forever. This kind of tension, created by the calculated risks players take, is what I strive for all the time. Unfortunately, when you rely on the bestiary, sometimes you can be disappointed when creatures don't live up to your expectations. Especially at high level, games like D&D 5e can rapidly accelerate the game into rocket tag, where you instantly kill anything you touch because your class features are so powerful. This can leave iconic creatures like the Lich in a tough spot. You expect them to be powerful enough to combat these adventurers, but the stat block in the monster manual isn't doing you many favors. Enter Lich. He's got a whole guide on how to turn that baby-ass bestiary Lich into a villain whose name you fear speaking lest they hear you. This video is gonna be me dissecting his video. I think his head is in the right place, but he also leads the inexperienced astray. I'll also give what few recommendations I can to fix the messes left behind by the poor game design the 5e devs left behind. The first minute or so of the video, Archie does bring up legitimate grievances.
But if you've ever actually run a Lich in combat against those higher level parties, you're likely to have found that they probably got their pushed in. Taking all of this into account, and considering that our Lich likely didn't even get to finish his cheesy Skeletor monologue, it's probably safe to assume that this encounter wasn't nearly as cool as it could have been for everyone involved.
D&D style games like 5th edition are deliberately built from the ground up to make whichever party with the most creatures have a significant advantage. An individual creature, provided they don't have like 10 levels on the party, will get their shit rocked by a group of 4+ player characters. This can make your big bad feel like they are weak, it can fail to meet expectations, and you as DM might feel like you failed your players, especially if this was the climax of a campaign. Wanting to fix this flaw that's baked into the game is completely understandable. After that, he goes into the Lich stats. I'll assume you're familiar.
Now, if your first reaction is just to increase the Lich's hit points, go sit in the corner and think about what you did.
The initial criticism of don't just increase its HP is misguided. Just a moment ago he said,
a single level 10 to 15 player can eat that HP for breakfast in a single action if they're built well enough.
So having more HP could remedy this. However, I do agree that only giving more HP would be a bad way to approach it. If you've ever played a video game before, you are probably familiar with phase transitions. If we have bosses in D&D to mimic the video game experience, why only stop halfway with extra actions? Make something dramatic happen at certain HP thresholds, something that disrupts the flow of battle, like causing the terrain to change, causing the Lich to change positions, or summoning a bunch of new minions. This makes the battle dynamic, and it makes it feel less like you're mowing through a Lich with double HP. The first part of Archie's recommendation is magic items, and the idea is solid. The fact that the monster manual did not give this ancient mage some magic items is absolutely criminal. Forcing the DM to do this is lazy game design. Let's see what items he picks. Staff of Power. Of course, don't increase his HP, just increase his other defensive stats. Stats are stats, regardless of where they go. More spells is nice, and +2 spell attack is fine, I guess. The comment,
Now, the Staff of the Magi is a super powerful pick too, but I still find the bonus to the AC just too good to pass up, since you have to keep in mind our Bone Boy needs all the survivability he can get.
Is again in direct conflict with what he said about increasing HP. I get wanting to reward players with loot, and having creatures actually use their loot makes them much more interesting. But this item alone is a poor example of improving the Lich outside of increasing his stats. Robes of the Archmagi. Here we go. More defensive stats. This time with an actually broken effect of +2 spell save DC. I've already gone over in another video why I think 5e's saving throw system is busted. Exceeding a DC of 20 is usually massive overkill. The Arcane Grimoire follows basically the same logic. Here is where the real meat and potatoes of the video starts. Everything up until now has not been particularly useful outside of making it so the Lich's spells might as well not have saving throws unless he's targeting a paladin, and slightly increasing his numbers. Actually running the combat to a big bad can be the most difficult part, so giving advice for how to run the combat itself is a great idea, especially for new DMs. Let's see how he approaches it.
So firstly, we have to work under a big assumption. The Lich is probably smarter than you, the DM, and that means they're going to have some crazy contingency plans. If they're going into a fight, they should be prepared, not just with items, but with a ready-made game plan as to how they are going to pick the party apart. Even if the party somehow stumbles upon the Lich unexpectedly, they're still going to have a general setup and plan for your average adventurers that they may expect to encounter. Here, it's going to be important to weave an intricate hellscape of glyphs of warding with all the types of gnarly spells that play off each other in the worst ways. Some good combos are Cloud Kill and a Wall of Force, Symbols of Death and Pain, counterspell glyphs keyed to go off on specific spells and spells of a certain level, Feeble Mind glyphs that auto-target anyone who casts a spell, that have their own counterspell glyphs to protect them in case someone tries to stop it with a counterspell.
This single list sets the tone for the rest of the video. What many of the effects he just listed amounts to is a bunch of free action spellcasts. How good of an addition this type of preparation is to you is probably close to how you see traps in D&D. Do you think that the game is fun when you are punished with large amounts of damage or debilitating status effects because you failed a perception, or in the glyph's case, investigation check? If this happens once, sure, my bad. Especially if you're using some type of grid with details that your DM telegraphs. But what is your limit? How many Wall of Force gas chambers, Feeble Minds, and counterspells would you need to trigger before you get frustrated? Again, I have an entire video on how counterspell warps the game, and this is precisely what I was talking about in that video. Because so many effects in the game are spells, counterspell can always be used, and it will always be frustrating. The fact that you can have contingent counterspells is just a natural extension of the terrible design of the spell. I suppose preparation is cool and all, but you can prepare in more ways than one, and in more interesting ways than I cast more spells. I think a much more interesting way to do this would be to know information about some of the player characters. If he's so smart, how could the Lich not predict who would attempt to end him? Imagine the party has a bounty on their heads for their misdeeds in a city, and the Lich made a deal with an adventuring party. These murderers are on my tail too. I can teleport you to my side when they find me so you can collect your bounty. This could be a way to not only reuse stat blocks you may have already had, but also to make preparation feel more grounded in the story. This can also be accomplished by having information related to the character's backstory, a hostage of a beloved NPC, or a shiny MacGuffin at risk. You know, bad guy stuff you see all the time that doesn't need to be made complicated by doing something like
There are also 15 different symbols, as in using the symbol spell. 5 of each. Again, the same spell DC. They are of insanity, pain, and stunning. And they are triggered by any being that isn't Xanax that enters, unless Xanax says a passphrase and declares them not a threat.
Minions are a staple to any boss fight, not only for thematic purposes, but also for balance. As mentioned before, more actions wins combats. If the Lich only has 1 or 2 actions a turn against 4 party members, he's likely not gonna make it. Adding minions to a boss battle in D&D is always a good idea. The next section, Archie goes over protecting his Lich's phylactery. This is more of the same kind of stuff we've already seen. Magic, layered on top of magic, layered on top of magic.
Here's what I wrote for Xanax's magical contingencies. Contingency 1, the intermediary demiplane. The first challenge is actually getting to the phylactery. For this, I've had Xanax do a couple of things. Xanax has an intermediary demiplane that he keeps. This is the plane that he will plane shift to with a special tuning fork that he keeps on him. The tuning fork is enchanted with an instant summon spell, and the respective gem to summon it is located in Xanax's prime demiplane. Xanax specifically plane shifts to this plane, rather than using the demiplane spell to get to the main plane, so that those spying on him can't actually see the demiplane, and then get access to it later by casting their own spell of demiplane.
There are so many layers and fine details to this magic that even plainly speaking out all of the effects and how they all loop together takes several minutes. I'm gonna get a little meta here to help drive the point I'm making home. Does any of this sound like fun? Do you want to spend hours upon hours looking at the exact wording of spells in order to dissect exactly how this Lich set up all of his fortifications? Perhaps you do find it fun, and I'm completely in the wrong. But in my experience, most players want to have conversations with interesting NPCs, defeat monsters that are ideologically opposed to good, and hang out with their buddies doing cool shit from their class. My comment about traps earlier is still very relevant here. I am aware that early on, D&D was entirely about navigating through dungeons. Figuring out the machinations of traps, locked rooms, and such was the whole point. The dungeon is such an iconic part of fantasy that it lives on through every single goddamn isekai and fantasy show. Another video. But not you, Dungeon Meshi! The point being, once upon a time, D&D was about carefully navigating through stone tunnels with 10-foot poles, using all manner of tools to outsmart whoever thought was keeping their treasure safe behind these traps. The game assumed that is how you were going to be playing, and so, as RPG players do, we bought into the system that was designed for such a thing. D&D 5e is not designed for such a thing. 5e is primarily about killing monsters. It's not like it doesn't have systems that allow you to mimic the kind of experience you get from a D&D game over 30 years ago, but generally speaking, design has changed to facilitate players doing cool things with class abilities, rather than coming up with creative ways to hit buttons and stop portcullises from sealing them in rooms. If you put a 5e character in an old school dungeon, Misty Step and Knock all on their own would probably invalidate the bulk of challenges that the dungeon typically provided. Another thing worth considering is that even if you did like old school style of D&D, where you had to meticulously plan out your movement across a dungeon floor so as not to trigger traps, the Lich private demiplane scenario is only like that in spirit. In practice, this is literally the realm of a caster. You can't even get to the Lich phylactery without high-level magic. You cannot play the Lich's game unless you have the spell that fixes the problem. Do you see what I mean by 5e isn't a good fit for this? Every obstacle along your path is going to be, do you have the correct spell to deal with this type deal? There is no creativity, there is no outsmarting the Lich's glyphs. You can't just activate the glyph safely from a distance with your pole. Hell, you can't even notice the glyphs since it's a DC 25 investigation check, because Archie said to increase the spell save DC so high. You so much as breathe in the wrong direction in these rooms, and instantly a Rube Goldberg machine of magic spells goes off, instantly transporting the phylactery you're hunting down elsewhere, and you straight to the afterlife with all the magic that then immediately explodes all over the place. While most of what Archie talks about in this section of the video is possible, and perhaps even realistic, I'd argue it's completely missing the point. The initial problem we wanted to solve wasn't, it's too convenient to kill a Lich. It was, the Lich big bad evil guy encounter fell flat, how do I make it more fun? The exact wording doesn't matter much, it was the intent behind the, man, Liches suck, and the desire to make them more interesting to run. The entire video is an essay on how to make something more complicated without making it much more fun. I know there are some people that might find untangling webs of magic fun, but half your players won't even be able to contribute because they don't have the spells to do so. It's pretty standard for mages to have most of the fun when it comes to this kind of thing, but at least marshals could help in some way, shape, or form in most scenarios, but not this one. Regardless of if it's what an all-powerful Lich would do, this is just gonna be a frustrating slog, every player's dream. The 5e developers didn't even give the Lich magic items. They probably did not put too much thought into what might happen when you layer a bunch of these magical effects on top of each other. These spells are designed to be used by the players. Players are more often than not the aggressors of any situation, and so such advanced levels of preparation would be lost on them. Devs also obviously don't take into account what it feels like when players are hit with the broken magic they were having so much fun with moments before. A hold person to take down a powerful warrior is fun and all until it's your fighter being targeted. If you start to actually optimize a wizard, the only thing that can stop it is a more optimized wizard. This is the pinnacle of D&D power we're talking about. Speaking of the pinnacle of power, all it would take to foil all of this Lich's contingencies is an anti-magic field. It would cause some complications because you would need to transport yourself between demi-planes, requiring you to drop the field and recast it. But luckily, glyphs of warding need to be able to target you to fuck you over, so invisibility patches that up. Anti-magic field only suppresses the invisibility effect, so when you drop it to shift to the prime demi-plane, you're still good. You just need a way to cast anti-magic field twice, shift planes twice, and have invisibility last long enough to do everything. Bada bing! Lich defeated. You see how magic trivializes even itself if you just know enough about spells? If that doesn't work, just wish for the passphrase so none of the glyphs activate. But this is, of course, assuming you even know literally anything about where it is you're going. Thanks to magic preventing divination, divination doesn't work. Only the Lich knows anything, and he can teleport away on a dime if he doesn't think there's enough glyphs in the area to increase the fun levels. If all conventional methods of gaining information fail, what is the DM hoping the players do? Divine intervention to gain information? Grind EXP until you can wish your way to victory? Even if you did manage to figure out a clever loophole, I'm sure Archie would find some way to say it doesn't work, like the contingency activates before you approach it with anti-magic, so it teleports away. Perhaps he'd rule that invis doesn't work to prevent the glyphs, but then invulnerability certainly would. There's never any winning against these kinds of DMs when they make these scenarios. You aren't meant to win. You are meant to be playthings, to fall into repeated traps that are designed to not be found. It is an inherently antagonistic design. The comments section only serves to verify this. The language of 5e children, in particular, is indicative of a spitefulness that I find is common amongst older enjoyers of the hobby. There's this weird gatekeeping they often do, where back in my day we had to do XYZ and you guys just get it handed to you. Rosy retrospection at its finest. I don't want to assume someone's entire character from a single YouTube comment, but it is an attitude of someone I wouldn't be looking for advice from.
It's important to understand that the Lich is going to have a crazy set of contingencies and defenses for its lair, and a party likely shouldn't be able to barge in there and expect to win. Speaking of contingency, the Lich should also always have a contingency spell on them to compensate for some weakness or possible outcome they may wish to circumnavigate. I often use a sending spell to a construct in a demiplane that will then activate a glyph of warding containing a wish to transport the Lich to said demiplane and to get it out of a sticky situation. Usually I tie it to a keyword or activation phrase the Lich must mutter or think.
Never do this. Having your enemy teleport away from you in the middle of a dramatic battle is lame. If you want to let the Lich get away scot-free because it's realistic, whatever ritual the players were stopping, whatever war they were waging, whatever other dramatic scenario you had that the final battle is in, better lead to victory for the players when the Lich pieces out. It might not be nearly as satisfying if the Lich gets away, but at least if they save the town from being sacrificed to make a Philosopher's Stone, then that's still a win. With that said, this wraps up Archie's video. Frankly, I think that the biggest takeaway from this is a fundamental part of game design. Games should be designed to be played. When you design a room filled with so many magical glyphs it could bankrupt a kingdom, you've gone too far. The strive for realism is something that can lead you down frustrating paths like these. D&D has historically had many problems with its magic system, giving casters the power of God with enough time and money. This is no different. Xanax feels like he is trying to reach rank 1 on the D&D ladder instead of providing a challenge that can be overcome by the players. The intention to make liches big and bad is a noble one, but Archie's approach is misguided, in my opinion. Like I stated before, there are a few ways you could make your lich more interesting and challenging. Making memorable boss encounters typically requires a bit of creativity on your part. Maybe the entrance to the Lich's lair has a few invisible, oversized, immovable rods in the way of advancing forward. Maybe there's an illusory wall or two to hide their minions. Most magic items in the game require an action to use, which would consume the Lich's turn, but perhaps he can activate magic items as a bonus or a legendary action, thanks to his mastery of them. Bonus action Beat of Force doesn't sound so bad. Or his minions could activate the items. Want a dramatic entry to the minions for your Draugr Deathlord? Try a Horn of Valhalla. I don't know much about 5e magic items, so you guys probably know better than I do. I already mentioned earlier some type of phase transition. At a certain threshold, the layer shatters into a bunch of floating stones as it gets sucked into the astral plane. Maybe the Lich creates some type of protective barrier, like a resilient sphere, until the start of his turn, that also knocks creatures back. Maybe the Lich becomes incorporeal and possesses a nearby gigantic statue, and each turn he resides within it, he heals some HP that he uses to continue the battle after the statue is destroyed. Depending on how difficult you want to be, any one of these things could work. And conveniently, none of them require glyphs of warding. Now that Archie has thoroughly described how to not make a Lich to facilitate a fun experience, I will leave you with what I think is quite possibly the coolest idea for a Lich I've ever seen. It doesn't go into painstaking detail as to what it does mechanically, but it is certainly more inspired than anything I have ever made. Being inspired to create as the DM is always a good first step to creating an awesome encounter. A comet that only comes close enough to the Earth to cast the ritual on it once every 10 years. The rest of the time it's hurtling through the solar system. If you ever do kill the Lich, you'll only have 10 years of peace, tops. Because when the comet comes close again, he jumps off and starts fucking shit up. It'll actually become a challenge, Every 10 years, adventurers wait to see a burning skeleton scream his way through the atmosphere at the speed of furious astronomy, trying to chart where he landed and hunt him down before he can hide and start fucking shit up. Whoever destroys his corporeal body gets a massive reward, as they have ensured the safety of the world until his next dissension. He's been hopping off the comet and landing all over the planet for centuries. So almost every culture has a terrible legend about the comet by now. That once every 10 years, if you haven't prayed or sacrificed enough, the screaming skeleton will come down and rip your face off, or bring the dead to life, or put coal in your stocking. Destroying the Lich is fairly difficult, but if your party is super high level, they can gear up and take the fight to him and destroy the comet, which by now he has turned into a full-on super castle like the asteroid Magneto had. If you want to read the full 4chan post where this is from, I'll just put more screenshots, that way you can pause and read the memes. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to hear me ramble about a specific topic, leave a comment and I'll consider it for a future video. Subscribe if you want to see it. I love talking about game design in general, with a focus on tabletop role-playing games. I have links for Twitter, Blue Sky, Discord, and the Knickknacks official website in the description, so you can start playing right now. I regularly post some of my favorite content I've made on social media. But until next time, farewell, fellow gamers.